the question I want to raise is a more general one, which is economic growth sustainable? And the role of technological progress or innovation in economic growth has been growing in the last 200 years. And it is the main reason why economic growth has turned out to be not a blip or a temporary thing, but actually sustainable. And the reason is that if you have an economy grow because of accumulation of capital, for instance, so you invest a lot in infrastructure and in capital goods, economics teaches us that this will eventually run into diminishing returns. That is not the case, however, for technological change. Technological change, as far as we can tell, is not running out of ideas. It is not running out of dynamism. And that, I think, is something that we have learned during the last 100 or 150 years. Now, this is not an uncontroversial position. There are people in my profession, as well as outside it, who basically claim that the low-hanging fruits of innovation have been picked. I mean, after all, we have invented air conditioning, we have invented indoor plumbing, we have invented nuclear reactors. We cannot invent them again, by definition. Is it possible that we eventually will run out of ideas? And I'm going to try to convince you that that is not the case. And the reason that I'm making this argument is precisely on the topic of what this conference is all about. And so, if you ask the question, when does science advance? One of the factors that drive science is technology. That is to say, the tools and instruments that scientists have to make discoveries. And one of the reasons why Greek and Hellenistic science, despite the genius of their scientists, really did not make nearly as much progress as they could have, is because they did not have advanced tools and instruments. In fact, they didn't even look for them. They were just reasoning very cleverly, but they did not have the kind of tools that emerged during the scientific revolution. And so the most famous example of a tool that drove science forward is, of course, Galileo's use of a telescope to look at the stars. But I could give you many other examples of that, and this is something that is not really controversial. But this relationship between technology driving science instead of the other way around, or in addition to the other way around, I should say, is something of which you can find endless examples. And it clearly is what makes science progress. For instance, if you think about maybe what is one of the most important discoveries of all time, which is the germ theory of disease by Pasteur and Koch in the late 19th century, this was driven by a much improved microscope that was developed a few decades earlier by a man called Joseph Lister, the father of the famous doctor, who was a microscope enthusiast and who made the microscope much better so that Koch and Pasteur could do their work on bacteriology. Another example of a major technological breakthrough that drove science ahead is, of course, the discovery of the structure of DNA by Rosalind Franklin using crystal spectroscopy in 1953. This was one of the more important discoveries of all time, but it wouldn't have happened without that instrument. Now, today, we are actually looking at an arsenal of tools and instruments that dwarfs anything else we have had in the past. And everybody in this room who is working as a scientist knows this, of course, from their own experience. And really, we make the tools of the past look like toys by comparison. So just to mention a few, of course, we have high-powered computers that can do things, computations and simulations that we wouldn't have even dreamed about in the 1950s and 1960s. We have gene editing tools like CRISPR-Cas. which has just come to the fore in the last decade. We have lasers who have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very powerful scientific applications. And of course, knocking on the door right now is artificial intelligence. I'm still not 100% sure what it will do to the economy, but clearly what it is doing to science and to progress in scientific knowledge has already been well established. And this is true for almost every area of human inquiry, including my own in economics. And so what I am arguing basically is that there is a mutual co-evolution of science and technology, in which on the one hand, of course, scientific progress drives technology. I mean, there are certain inventions that you just couldn't make unless you really understood the science. I mean, nobody is going to discover building a nuclear reactor by accident, right? You have to know some nuclear physics. I mean, this is kind of obvious. But what is important to realize that, as I just argued, technology then feeds back into science. And the two basically constitute some kind of virtuous circle and positive feedback mechanism in which science drives technology and technology in turn drives science. Okay. Now, what we know about positive feedback mechanisms is that if the parameters are high enough, and I think in this case they are, this dynamic system will not converge. It will continue to change. And that, I think, is the reason why I think that even though the low-hanging fruits have been picked, science provides us with ladders to climb higher and higher in this tree of knowledge, to coin a phrase, and that we will continue to progress and advance in our scientific knowledge and the technological implications thereof. This system, as I said, may be dynamically not converging and therefore continue essentially forever. Now, is it the good news or the bad news? And that, in some sense, remains to be seen. The tools are powerful and becoming ever more powerful. But of course, with every advance in technology, there is the danger of its being used for salutary purposes to make us healthier or stronger or smarter, or they could be abused by repressive governments, by evildoers of various kinds, by cyber criminals or other kind of criminals. I mean, this remains to be seen, whether making us more and more powerful technologically actually makes society a better place. I think that's something that's still a sort of concern for almost any observer from the outside. After all, institutions and politics don't seem to be nearly as progressive as technology and science. And so if these powerful tools fall into the wrong hands, this could be a source of major concern. The second question I want to raise very briefly is whether we actually should. It's not just whether we can, but whether we should. And there is today an ideology that many people adhere to, which basically says that we should no longer grow, we should no longer keep developing technology, and we have plenty of stuff to do, and we really need a society that's more equal, more just, more pleasant, and we should stop growing because growth is bad, because it ruins the environment, it creates inequality, it creates alienation, and on and on and on. And it is true that living standards, particularly in the West, are high. They are not everywhere in the world, I don't have to tell you. And so you could argue that even though maybe countries like Norway and the Netherlands and Luxembourg are rich enough and don't have to grow anymore, so I'm not arguing that, but some people could. That wouldn't be true for places like Cameroon and Niger. And so that's, I think, worth keeping in mind. But there are other reasons why we should keep growing, and I want to point them out very briefly because I think they point to the sort of fallacy of people who want to stop economic growth, particularly the kind of economic growth I was describing earlier, which is economic growth that is driven by technology. And one of them is, of course, dealing with climate change. I think much of the consequences of climate change are still not known. We're still learning this. There's a recent paper written by a colleague of mine, Diego Kenzig, which is now arguing that the costs of climate change have been vastly underestimated, and that they may be 4 or 5 times higher than the most pessimistic estimates that economists have come up with before. This still is an open debate. I think the last word has not been said about it. But the one thing that I think we can be absolutely certain about is that whatever happens to climate change, and however big it's going to be, it is going to be expensive, because we will have to adapt and adjust and change our infrastructure and our tools in a host of fields, all the way from water control to agriculture to perhaps experimenting with changing the atmosphere, for instance, carbon capture and things like that. Now, none of those things will be cheap. They will require more, not fewer resources. And economic growth, by definition, provides us with more resources. So if we do not continue to grow, our ability to cope with climate change, which is going to happen no matter where, in fact, it is happening right now, is going to be very limited. And the results may be quite devastating. And so we have to keep on growing. And it is only thanks to science and technology that we will be able to cope with this threat, because political solutions don't seem, sadly enough, to be on the horizon. There's a second reason, and that will be my final point, why we need to keep growing. And that is that in addition to climate change, the human race is facing a very serious threat through demography. We will observe a decline in growth rates in almost every economy in the world for the simple reason that the age structure of the population is changing, and the number of people in their more advanced ages who are not working is going to grow relative to the people who are still in the labor force. And that is not just a concern in Europe, where every nation is below replacement fertility, and in East Asia, but it will eventually spread to every nation in the world. Now, what that means is that we will need to use resources to pay for the care and the maintenance of people who are consuming but no longer work. That is to say, pensioners and old folk. And their medical expenses will be higher than the average person in the population, and very few of them will continue to work. I'm one of the people who continues to work, but I may be an exception there. And so there too, then, what we need is more growth, maybe different growth than we've had in the past, but more growth. Maybe not maybe, surely different growth. But we will need to develop the tools and the instruments, using robotics, using artificial intelligence, in order to take care of this ever-growing cohort of old people who are still around and who need medical care, who need a variety of forms of assistance and help. And whatever else happens, that too will be expensive, ladies and gentlemen. And so more, not less growth will be needed. And I think that that kind of growth can only be supplied by the continuing accumulation of useful knowledge, of the kind of knowledge that we discovered in the 17th and 18th century can drive economic growth and economic progress. Without that, the consequences may be very dire indeed. Thank you all very much. I hope you have a wonderful conference, and I wish you peace in this world. Thank you very much.